Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and the date is Tuesday, the 6th of February. Over the weekend, El Salvador went to the polls. El Salvador is a country that Ronald Reagan once said was on the front line of the battle that is really aimed at the very heart of the Western Hemisphere and eventually at us. Now, that was during El Salvador's civil war, running from 1979 to 1992, in which the US supported a brutal counterinsurgency. El Salvador is now once again of regional and even global interest, and that's mainly because of its young president, Nayib Bukele, and his crackdown on gangs. The country's murder rate was 53 per 100,000 people in 2018, the year before Bukele took office. It's now one of the lowest in the region, at 2.4 per 100,000 last year. How has he done this? Well, Bukele's locked up something like 76,000 people, which means that 2% of the population is behind bars. He's also introduced Bitcoin as legal tender and has introduced a state of emergency that's been running since 2022. Over the weekend, Bukele, who remains very popular it seems, was re-elected in what seems to be an enormous landslide. On Sunday, Bukele said El Salvador never had democracy. This is the first time in history that El Salvador has democracy, and it's not me saying it, it's the people. This is from a man who once labeled himself the coolest dictator in the world. At the same time, just before the election, his vice president, Felix Ulloa, said, "To those who complain that democracy is being dismantled, my answer is yes. We are not dismantling it, we are eliminating it, and we are replacing it with something new." In a Latin American context, in which support for democracy is waning and violent crime is on the increase, it seems like the Bukele model could spread. Plenty of politicians across the region have been pretty explicit in their admiration of El Salvador's president. But what actually is Bukelismo? How different is it from traditional authoritarian right across the continent? How has he actually lowered the murder rate? Is it just locking people up, or have there been negotiations with gangs? And is his sort of rule replicable in other countries? To figure all this out, I'm going to be talking to, firstly, Nelson Rauda, a Salvadoran journalist, and then to delve deeper into the regional and ideological features of Bukelismo, I'll be calling up Juan Rojas, who writes about Latin America for Compact magazine. Now, for the full episode, you'll need to subscribe to this podcast at patreon.com/bungacast. There you'll also get access to several unique paywalled episodes a month. And just to foreshadow what we've got coming up over the rest of the next month, we've got coverage of Indonesia's upcoming elections, several discussions on the role of emotion in politics, particularly emotions like anger and resentment, and much else besides. So I hope to see you there. That's at patreon.com/bungacast. Okay, hello, I'm here with Nelson Rauda, who's going to tell us about the situation in El Salvador. Nelson is an editor at El Faro, an investigative online-only outlet. So, hi, Nelson, welcome. And could you tell us a little bit about what El Faro is?
Hi, thanks for having me. I am. I've been working in El Faro for almost a decade now. El Faro was born as a post-war, post-Civil War newspaper in El Salvador in 1998. El Salvador had gone through a civil war through the 80s. And at that time, it was considered by the founders that there's the necessity of a news outlet that didn't respond to the traditional powers. The traditional media in El Salvador responded to the right wing, and then there was some left wing media, but it was considered that there needed to be a new outlet that didn't necessarily respond to any of the traditional powers. So ever since El Faro was born, it started clashing heads with politicians. At the beginning, that was the right wing. Then when the left wing came into power, El Faro started investigating the left wing, and nowadays we are pretty much in Bukele's collision course.
Right, right. Yeah, so you're a roadblock, I guess, as you would see yourselves to him claiming ever greater power.
We consider ourselves to be a newspaper in resistance. Essentially, we since Bukele's term, we have been exiled as a newsroom. We move our administrative operation to Costa Rica because of the Bukele government harassment. We have been spied on with Pegasus software. I was personally spied 2 months, or a little over 2 months, but uh, there's been an obsessive spying on 22 members of El Faro, which is incredible because we're
Mhm.
like a 30-person team. We have been audited for in the finance ministry because Bukele said that we launder money, which is also incredible because the first requirement to launder money is to have money, and we are independent journalists. We have no money. Uh, and yeah, there's a lot of things, and it has to do with the things that we have been able to uncover about Bukele's regime.
Right. So on that, there's obviously been the election at the weekend. What would you say the mood is in El Salvador now? With such a resounding victory, does it feel like everyone is aboard the Bukele train, or I guess it does depend on the region, neighborhood that you're in?
First of all, I would ask, what resounding victory? We don't have any results of the election. We have a Bukele tweet claiming that he won with a percentage, and claiming the amount of seats that he wants at the legislative center. I don't know, maybe I have this wild idea that when you have elections, you should count the results before making assumptions of who won and by how margin. But maybe these are old-fashioned ideas in these new democracies like Bukele is running. Uh, I don't know. He could have just sent us an email. I won by this margin, and this is the amount of seats I have at the parliament. Congratulations. Um, and people don't seem to care. I wouldn't say it was. I say it's maybe festive, and then there's some of us that are raining on the parade, saying stupid stuff like maybe we should count the votes. Um, but the other thing is that there's not a sense of wild like if the election was on Sunday, people associated with him celebrated. A lot of people celebrated in social media, and then it was back on Monday. Everybody got to feed their family, everybody got to go to work. uh, you did see his celebration at night on Sunday, but then it's Monday. You have to feed your children. So, and then there was some protest. A group of feminists, small group of feminists, was mobilized yesterday to protest what they are considering an electoral fraud. We have no preliminary results whatsoever. We have no idea even of how much the attendance really was at the polls. And what the results were showing was like amazing in the system when they were showing the results. For one hand, it said that no votes have been counted in this specific department in Cabañas. But on the other hand, when the system was put to zero, Bukele's party already had 10,000 votes. So it was like blatantly charged to favor him in spite or in top of everything that they have done fraudulent towards this election. We call it coronation. Because he shouldn't have been able to run in the first place. This election was doubtful of how legitimate it is since the moment that his face was allowed to go in the ballot.
Right. And a lot of his rule so far has been very personalized, I think, right? His figure as someone who can solve problems and solve particularly El Salvador's problems with gangs and crimes, I think has been very much to the fore. So it'd be interesting to know a little bit of Bukele's history. He was part of the left wing party and then kind of moves to the center. If you could tell us a little bit about that history.
He is the son of a millionaire family that was never really accepted in the Salvadoran elite, mostly made of people from Spain ascent and Palestine. Uh, so he starts being a mayor and essentially creates all his political career with the left party. His father had liaison with the left wing party, the former guerrilla, el FMLN. um, and he then starts shifting as he is in power. When he gets to be the mayor of San Salvador, the capital, he runs into a fight with the party, with the FMLN, because he wanted to be the presidential candidate. He gets himself expelled from the FMLN, and he runs not with center. I would never describe him as center. He runs with a right wing party, and then he has essentially behaved like a right wing party. I don't think anybody could consider him center, because he was very friends with Trump. He instated a border patrol in El Salvador. He signed asylum agreement, the third country asylum agreement with Trump. Then things started going south with the U.S. when Biden came into power. He started clashing with the U.S. and then he started dressing himself as this anti-imperialist, more like Viktor Orban, more like this trying to be anti-system while being so uh, deeply part of the system.
Mm.
Uh, he has run like a right wing. Like I would consider him like a corporativist. Uh, yeah, like a corporativist model. Maybe I'm influenced by this. I'm reading Naomi Klein's Doctrine of Shock. But in that sense, in making everything private, he says the public should be better than the private, but then he privatizes everything, and
Mm.
he centralizes everything. So yeah, I would describe him as very much on the right wing.
So, I mean, it reminds me a little bit of a figure like Tony Blair or even Bill Clinton in being kind of third way ish, although perhaps more adapted to the ideological climate of the 2010s, 2020s than of the 1990s. Insofar as a lot of his setting up of a new party, Nuevas Ideas, new ideas, and the adoption of Bitcoin and all these kind of elements speak to a certain kind of technocratic bent, I think, and an idea to present oneself as new and young, of a new generation, getting rid of the old left and the old right, and we're moving on. A kind of presenting an idea of generational renewal. Do you think is that an important part of what he's selling?
I think he's a very skilled advertiser. I think he's much better advertiser and PR man than a politician. And maybe that's what it takes to be a successful politician nowadays. You're just branding yourself and selling yourself as this image of this innovative. Well, it's essentially a traditional Latin American caudillo, but with a X account, and without techno disguise. But this is an authoritarian dystopia with very good advertising.
Right. So, I mean, to get on to the authoritarianism, because I think that's the part that most stand out about his rule, and indeed have been most influential, it seems, across the region. So, the state of emergency is brought in March 2022, which itself, I think, was a development of the state of emergency that was brought in during the pandemic. So maybe we can talk, I think, firstly, if we work through this chronologically, what the state of emergency was like during the pandemic.
So I think it's very important. Bukele starts being a president in June 2019, and then he stays the state of emergency in 2020 through the pandemic, which essentially means that he has ruled most of his term under a state of exemption. So Salvadorans have lost their constitutional rights since then. And the origin of the state of exception that we're currently in has to do, and this is the part that people miss or don't get or don't want to see about Bukele. Why did he stay the state of exception in March 2022? Because the gangs killed 87 Salvadorans in one weekend. And why did the gangs kill 87 Salvadorans in one weekend? Because Bukele had a truce with the gangs. This is deeply documented, not only by us at El Faro, but also by other investigations. The U.S. Department of Treasury has sanctioned people. The Department of State has sanctioned people for this. Now they don't remember. Now they are calling him democratically elected, congratulating him, because that's just how the U.S. operates. But there was a truce, a negotiation with the gangs, electoral support, a decline in homicides in exchange for benefits in prison. The U.S. has even gone on to say that they have given money to prisons, to gang leaders in prison. But the most obvious, and I know maybe people are hearing me and are expecting that Bukele is this, wonder world and paradise, and I'm just a position. Okay, don't believe me. I don't need people to believe me, but I would point you out to Google Crook, MS-13 Crook, because this was a gang leader that was sentenced to 40 years of prison. He still had 40 years of prison left in El Salvador. He was let go by the Bukele administration. We published audios of a Bukele official, Carlos Marroquin, saying that he personally took him out of prison, took him to Guatemala, and then just this November, Krug was arrested in Mexico and deported. Well, not deported, but he was transferred to Houston, and now he's in jail on charges of terrorism in the United States. So this is Krug is the living proof that there was a gang involved, a negotiation with gangs and the government. If not, why is he not in prison, or why was he not extradited? And Bukele, filled his mouth saying that. If the international community so wants gang members, take them, adopt these little angels. That's the way he speaks about it. The United States was claiming this guy, and they said, okay, give us this guy, we're going to prosecute him in New York. And they didn't, and they haven't extradited any of the gang leaders. Why? Because when they are in a nice Long Island jail cell negotiating, they are going to sing like birds. And Bukele doesn't want that because it
Right.
messes up with his image.
So I want to get on to all that negotiating and deal making with the gangs and the way that Bukele has managed, it seems, to drastically reduce the murder rate and indeed the degree of extortion that goes on as well. So I want to come on to that in just a second. But to give maybe listeners a sense of what the state of emergency was like, whether during the pandemic and indeed the one that then was introduced in March 2022. What's that been like for ordinary citizens? Is it something that you notice on the streets of San Salvador, or is it something that it happens on the peripheries? What does it look? Is it people being stopped by the police, searched, harassment? What is it like?
In poor neighborhoods, yeah. I don't think people realizes what the pandemic was like for us, because we didn't have public spaces in the pandemic. We don't have many public spaces in El Salvador, but there was a prohibition of everything. Essentially, you needed your ID number to go to go buy groceries, and if you didn't have, there was a system. The last number of your ID number, if it was 9, you could go on Monday or Wednesday, and if not, you wouldn't be allowed to shop. Uh, there was a public transportation ban. He essentially ordered all public transportation to stop in the country. So people, because they need to go to work, because we don't have savings, we don't have checks, we don't have that kind of thing. We had $300 checks at one time, but what can you do for that for 6 months? Um, so people were like cramping on pickup trucks to move around. People were arrested and taken to contention centers, like essentially going to prison for 30 days just for walking in the street without a permit. So
Wow.
when people complain in the Western Hemisphere about what the COVID was really like, you haven't lived in an authoritarian state, and then you have, which is for me, I don't know, very. It makes me my blood boil a little bit. That then you have these libertarian technocratics celebrating how Bukele has made this into a world, yeah, a world leader of freedom. When if you had been a Salvadoran living in a poor neighborhood and your government had done all of these things during the pandemic, you would have been crying and dictator, dictator.
Mm,
But it's
yeah.
not happening to you, or it's not happening to white people, then it's okay. It's absurd.
So that, I mean, that looks like it was a bit of a trial run for the state of emergency that's then
Yeah.
brought in 2022 in response to this new wave of killings. How is the new state of emergency, which remains in place? How is that different from the one that
So
was?
there's a significant difference that during the pandemic state of emergency, we had a constitutional court, an independent constitutional court that essentially said to Bukele, you cannot do these things. You need to have more controls. And Bukele went on television decrying these justices and said, if I was a dictator, I would have them all killed, and it would be a fair exchange because I would just be sacrificing five lives in exchange of many. They are telling me to go to let Salvadorans be killed because of the virus. So that's his democratic character and his gracious character of not having people, rounded up and killed. Uh, just because they don't think like him. So when Bukele he won the midterm elections by landslide, and what the first thing he did, and by that point he had a lot of power. He had the executive branch, the legislative branch, and then he used his legislative branch power to take over illegally the constitutional court. The Salvadoran Supreme Court has 15 justices, and every term gets to elect five. So you get to renovate a third of it. The Bukele election has elected 10. It's illegal, but people don't seem to care because first of all, homicides went down, and then with the other, when the agreement with the gangs went down, he really put an iron fist, rounded up over 75,000 people in less than 2 years. And that has made a change in communities, and we can go on about that. But I think that is basis of popularity, but it's all done in a political landscape where you have no oversight, you have no checks and balances. You cannot consider this a democracy. See, if a single person controls every institution in the state, maybe people can define that as what you want. I don't think we would pass any democratic uh, checkbook or any democratic list of characteristic that makes something democratic. El Salvador wouldn't pass, and it wouldn't have passed it for years now.
It'd be interesting to get a sense on the ground what it has been like in El Salvador over the past decade or so, because the murder rate was so extremely high, one of the highest in the world, comparable to levels of civil war. Indeed, I think at certain points the murder rate in El Salvador was higher than it was during El Salvador's own civil war. And I guess I don't know if you might be skeptical of some of the reporting on the numbers today on how much the murder rate has actually fallen. But nevertheless, I think it would be, kind of fairly universal consensus, I would imagine, that the murder rate has fallen. So what was the violence like in the mid 2010s, I think, when it reached its peak? And how is it different
Well,
now?
it's very different. I mean, El Salvador, we cannot compare it to civil war violence because the numbers of the civil war were not reliable. It was under a dictatorship. There were at least 75,000 persons killed in 10 years, so it's non comparable. But after the war, certainly there were peaks of violence, and we can explain by different things. The post war years were especially violent because there was a lot of crime, and there was, you know, you don't stop a killing machine on its tracks. It takes some time, and there was some type of rebuilding. But when the country was rebuilding, the Clinton administration sent back thousands of deported gang members that created the gang problem. Then it was very poorly handled by the right wing government, and then
Actually, if I can just interrupt you there, because it might be useful to explain that history as well. So, I mean, these two main gangs in El Salvador, MS-13 and Barrio 18, they emerged from the U.S., right?
yeah, they are born in California, in Los Angeles. The Barrio 18 is an all time gang that has been in California for a long time. I think probably the 20s or 30s. And then the MS-13 is a band that was formed with the sons of Salvadoran exiles or refugees during the war that weren't really accepted by any of the other gangs in the California ecosystem. So they banded together. They created MS-13. It was Mara Salvatrucha Stoners at that time, and then they eventually got the number 13, which is related to the Mexican mafia. And then it was the Clinton administration that decided at the mid 90s, 96, 97, to start deporting them to El Salvador, to a country that essentially had weak institutions or no institutions in some cases. And this created a snowball of a problem that became the scourge of the Salvadoran people for decades. So the situation was pretty dire. In 2015, we had a homicide rate of 105 for every 100,000 inhabitants. So it was pretty dire. The gangs had territorial control on a lot of the neighborhoods, and different solutions were tried out. Uh, Mano dura, as they call it, like the strong hand. There was a previous truce in 2012, but none of them really worked to solve this problem. So Bukele tried the two things in 5 years. He first established a truce, and then he established a real iron fist. But obviously, things have changed for Salvadorans. This you have to acknowledge. This is a country that has only 7 years of school in average. So and all of these things that we talk about in political circles, and like the rule of law and democracy and all of these things, were essentially empty words, empty promises for a lot of people. So what is happening in El Salvador has also to be an indictment of what happens when democracy fails to deliver. Um, because people don't seem to care about democracy any more than going to elections, and that's what democracy is about. And the whole legitimacy of the Bukele regime now is that millions have voted for him. We don't know how many on Sunday because we have no results till we're recording this podcast. Uh, but people seem content with that, and I think the main reason of his popularity is that people seem they feel safer, and we have reported on this. We have gone to communities. We have essentially said that Bukele has this article or dismantled the way gangs operated. Homicides have gone down a lot. They have not gone down as much as the government says it has. Because the government is toying around with the statistic. They are, for instance, if someone they say is a criminal dies, they don't count as a murder, or they don't count. They're telling a lot. There has been report about it, but the homicide number has gone down significantly. And one of the key aspects of the Bukele administration is to keep everything under lock. So we don't have much access to public information, but we have reports that people are not longer paying extortion to the gangs in a lot of sites. So that there has been a dismantling. Besides that, uh, there's very little that we can know for sure in the Bukele administration, and things are besides that have essentially remained the same. Immigration to the United States remains high. Remittances are still one quarter of the economy. There's no new job creation.
Mm.
Uh, and the poverty has gone up. Poverty has gone up almost 5 points under Bukele's administration. So things have not changed essentially outside of that, but people feel safer. And when you feel safer, I mean, if I had, I'm privileged in this country. I'm part of the 10% because I got to go to college, and only 10% of this country gets to go to college. Um, but if I had lived in a gang controlled territory, there would be a pretty strong appeal to voting for this government. I still know a lot of people in those neighborhoods who think this is not democracy. It's not good that a person controls all the power. But there's no denying the change that has been.
So the violence itself, I mean, from my experience here in the state of Sao Paulo, for example, I mean, the reason why Sao Paulo has a much lower homicide rate than it once used to, which used to be very high, is because one gang has a monopoly, basically, and it's the largest drug trafficking gang in South America. And so crime has gone down. Whereas in other states in Brazil, the murder rate is very high, and that's because of conflicts over territory between drug gangs. Why was it so high in El Salvador? Is it because of conflicts between those two gangs? Where did that violence actually come from?
Well, it had to do with gang turf control. That's part of it, but a lot of it, it depends. For instance, in 2015, when we had that high murder rate I was talking about, the difference was that we had just gone out of a truce, and the police and the government essentially declared the war on gangs. So there was a lot of infighting. There was, uh, when we reported gangs attacking soldiers and policemen, over, I don't know, 70 murders of policemen in a year, maybe more. I don't remember the exact figures. The police was killing a lot of gang members in so-called, like face-offs. And also there were death squads operating inside the police. And I don't know. We as a country are a history of violence, that we come from the Spanish invasion in the 1400s, and that obviously starts a tradition of violence that has never really stopped. And in 1932, we had a indigenous genocide, and nobody really paid the penalties for that. Nobody was judged for that. Then inaugurated a period of military dictatorship. Then we had the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, we had this very short-lived democratic era from 1992 to this past Sunday, um, where we had a democracy. But for instance, the crimes of the Civil War were never really judged. There's no top official convicted in El Salvador for massacres that involved thousands of people, innocent. So we have a tradition, a long romance with impunity in this country, and that creates a culture of impunity, and that creates a culture of violence. So you will have to see specifically what happening in each period, but uh, we have as a society a history of violence.
In a context, obviously, of poverty, of low growth, few opportunities, these gangs are able to hoover up lots of young men in particular, and that becomes a form of economic activity. What actually is their economic activity? I mean, where do they are they trafficking drugs? Is it mainly extortion? What is their principal activity?
Yeah, the money they got was mainly for extortion, but you have to understand. I guess the gangs are criminal organizations, but the alternative that the society was giving to people, to young people in gang controlled neighborhoods, was, don't be a gang member, go get this excruciating job and win $300 a month, and try to support your family in that. So the appeal for a lot of people, there was talks about more than 50,000, 50,000 gang members in Salvador, was that wouldn't uh, you wouldn't have to endure all of that. You would have access to money and access to some level of respect through fear and intimidation and crime in the community. But you would be a someone. It was different to be, the low level employee at this company earning pennies, than to be a gang member, or a member of the clique. And that was the appeal. And it's a desperate situation. It's a dire situation. The gangs are criminals. The gangs are crime members. But uh, I guess you would have to be in that situation to see, and most of us cannot even imagine having to decide between those thoughts. But the reality is that even if violence has gone down, and crime has gone down, the conditions that created the gangs are still here. That hasn't
Sure.
changed at all in this country.
So, what is the basis of, like, in particularly the class basis of Bukele's support? Is it because I understand, obviously, in those neighborhoods which are most afflicted by violence, has maybe some support, but at the same time, those are also the people who are getting rounded up, often, without trial, and thrown in prison.
Yeah, what I would say is that in for Bukele, people is very happy with Bukele until they are not, and when they are not, there's nothing that you can really do, because he controls the court, the attorney general, the police, the army, everything that there is to control. So if you are a part, if you live in a gang controlled neighborhood and you are not a relative of anybody who has been unfairly arrested or is rotting in jail for months or years, then there's a very likely possibility that you're very happy with it. If you have been directly affected by it, you might be less happy about it. But then, and then polling shows that the more money you have, uh, the more income you have, or the higher you low in the income bracket, the less you like Bukele, and the higher you go in the education bracket, the less you like Bukele. Uh, so that's pretty clear. And then uh, I don't know. You will have to think what it takes for a man to become a dictatorship and control every aspect of the power, and you have to realize that uh, Bukele's rival in 2019 was calling people to vote in a civic and democratic party on Sunday, we're talking about the heir of a million, one of the millionaire companies in El Salvador. There's a quake happening as we speak, so I'm a little distracted because it's really strong. This happens a lot, quite a lot in this country.
Wow, I mean, you can't tell it from the image, actually. So I,
It's still happening, so I'm sorry about that. Maybe you'll have to edit it. I'm just trying to see that the building
so,
will not. I think I'm good. So the millionaires, the people that, that allow Bukele to take control, the millionaires have been with Bukele. The wealthiest families of the country have been with Bukele, and I think we have seen what we saw perhaps in Nicaragua, that the wealthy, the super wealthy class, is very content with him until they are not. But we have seen a lot of fear, and I would say cowardice, from a lot of people who could say, have something to say, because the people that are left saying, us crazy people that are pointing out that the emperor is naked, are few, and we, I consider it myself, and my position in this society, one of responsibility, one of speaking out for a lot of people that are very afraid of speaking out, because we have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and we have seen what happens to people who oppose Bukele. The exception regime has been used not only to confront or to go against gang members, but they have also incarcerated uh, environmental leaders, political opposition. Uh, it's pretty blatant. If you don't want to believe Bukele is an authoritarian, you could, but it's pretty blatant that all the signs are there. Uh, that's a part of it.
I mean, I guess one devil's advocate argument you could make in favor of Bukele is that yes, it's all anti-democratic, authoritarian, um, trampling on civil liberties, etc. But that the dealing with the gang situation and reducing the level of violence and insecurity is basically an attempt by the state to keep up its very basic sort of Hobbesian bargain with the citizenry to basically keep people safe, and that this strong hand will at least provide the space and capacity for politics and normal economic life to actually happen. And so it might be distasteful, but it might be necessary. What would you say to that?
Well, it's very easy to say that when you don't have a personal stake, when it's not your son or daughter who is unfairly imprisoned, when it's not your relative who has died in jail, when it's not your father, like Carolina Amaya's father, who was arrested for months. It's very easy to just call it out as collateral damage when you're not the one looking for your disappeared son, because they won't say to you in what prison he's in. It's super easy to say it, and that's what we keep trying to do. Let's see the human side of it. I don't believe the argument that you need a state of exemption uh, to deal with this forever. How exceptional it is, we've been almost 2 years with this. I don't believe that you need to take away all of our rights. You know what the state of exception is like. They get to seize your communication or to spy your communication without judicial warrant. If you are arrested, you don't get the right to an attorney. If they are augmented, or they increased the pre-trial detention to over 2 years. They don't fulfill legal terms. I mean, it's very easy to say and it's very easy to defend when it's not being applied to you. But if it was being applied to you, you would want people like us, journalists and human rights defenders, to speak out and say, hey, this isn't fair. Obviously, I don't think a lot of the people who were just clinging on survival would say these arguments, or would even care. They are happier and they are entitled, and are in the right to be happier because their lives have increased. That doesn't mean that everything that Mr. President does is fair, and what we are saying is that it's not legal under the Salvadoran law. It doesn't seem to matter, but I think, even as a historical, you know, side note, it has to be noted someone said this isn't right.
So, Bukele's success in reducing the murder rate and in extortion, by many reports that I've read, it seems that people attest to the fact that the amount of extortion going on, or the regularity or the amount that people are having to pay is greatly reduced. So, how durable do you think that situation is? Whether you put it down to Bukele arresting huge swathes of people, I think like 2% of the population is now in prison, or whether it's the deal making with the gangs that they come to some arrangement. Maybe you could also tell us about some of that deal making, kind of what the nature of those arrangements actually are. But also, irrespective of what you put it down to, how durable do you think this is?
We don't know. It depends on how much. I think the IMF might have a say on this. Bukele is still seeking for a large agreement, around 1.3 billion with the IMF, and if they do give him, we will have the 2024 to whatever Bukele dictatorship sponsored by the IMF. Um, but the economic situation is dire. There has been talks, huge talks of uh, the government need to be bailed out, or the government not being able to afford the international debt. Um, and keeping there was around 40,000 people in prison in El Salvador before the state of exception. So plus 75,000, you're talking about maybe 120,000 people in prison. That's not cheap to maintain. For how long? And they are talking about doing mass trials of 900 people. So at a time, and they have reformed the laws to do that. So how are you, and if you convict them all to 40 years in prison, how much is that bill? This is not a rich country, so that sustainability has to be linked directly with the economic sustainability of the regime. um, so of course that is a question. And the other part is that there has been a lot of corruption in his government. Has been a lot of looting. We have published, not only El Faro, but Salvadoran Journal has published stories about the Minister of Health, Francisco Alavi, buying medical supplies from his family's company during the pandemic. We have talked about the Bukele whip, the Christian Guevara, getting $1 million in contracts to renew hospitals during the pandemic. We have revealed how Vice Minister of Security, Osiris Luna, sold groceries, 42,000 bags of groceries that were intended for the hungry in the pandemic. He sold them for personal profit. We have, I could go on and on and on. Uh, so there's also, because Bukele's campaign motto is the money is enough for no one stealing. Well, we have proven there's a lot of people taking money out of it, and that doesn't help the economic sustainability of it all. So yeah, I
And
cannot answer your question, but I do have that question.
Okay, so just two more questions. One on politics and the other on economics. Firstly, what opposition do you see remaining to Bukele, or indeed do you see any kind of opposition emerging, particularly from the working class and poor, who at some point might get fed up with having their kids rounded up and arrested, for example?
Where there is power, there is always going to be opposition. So, in terms of politically organized opposition, we don't know, because we don't have any idea of how many congressmen from opposition parties. We have four opposition parties. We don't know how many of them will get a seat in Congress. And as I've been telling you, the elections have been absolutely fraudulent from the not just the presidential run of Bukele, which is unconstitutional and it should be said so. But we don't even have a number of the votes, and we don't even have the chain of custody of the ballots has been broken. And it has been denounced by several of the opposition parties just these days after the election. So we don't have any idea of that number. We just have the number that Bukele has said that he has, and yeah, I honestly have this question if the votes are going to be counted or if they are just going to make them go to what Bukele desire is. This is, of course, a dictatorship, so you have to take that into account. If that happens, or how does that happen, we're about to see. Um, but there is opposition. We had a march of teachers who haven't been paid in just days before the election. We have the relatives of imprisoned people, the defenders of innocence. We have the journalists. We have the human rights defenders. We have the environmentalists. We have the students from the only national university which has been occupied for 3 years, with the government owes money to millions of dollars in budget that they haven't assigned to. So you have what I always describe is that is if Bukele is working a four-burner kitchen and there's things boiling in them constantly. So at one time, maybe one will overflow, and that's when you will see the other side of Bukele, the one that we are warning of, that he has all the pieces of the chess and that he's going to use them when that popularity runs out. Because I also believe in gravity. And he cannot go any higher than this 80% approval at a two-term, a re-election and constitutional re-election, but re-election nevertheless. He cannot go any higher than this. So the only way that he can continue to go down, if we believe in physics and the laws of trajectory, is down. And when he goes down, he has prepared himself to deal with the opposition, to deal with critical voices when he goes down. And how will he deal with him? Well, we have to look at what Nicaragua did in 2018. We have to look at Venezuela. We have to look at every military dictatorship, and that's where I see things going. I don't know when. I don't know, maybe in a couple months, in a couple years, in a decade. But uh, I don't think he can remain popular forever if public opinion is very feeble.
hmm So, one last question, just to finish off. There's a lot of talk of Bukele serving as a model across the region, talk of adoption of Bukelismo. Uh, Part of that, I mean, the main part of that is his role in fighting crime. Now, I wonder how effective that model is and how appealing that model is if there isn't also some sort of economic success story to sell there. Is there any economic success story to sell? Even his much talked about initiative of making Bitcoin legal tender seems to maybe be something he'll have to ditch to get an IMF loan. So what is there of what is his legacy so far in economic terms?
Well, he has increased, poverty has increased 5 points almost in his 5 year terms, and economy has replaced insecurity as the main concern of the population, because he has touted El Salvador as such a paradise to come live. There's a lot of gentrification happening, especially near the shores. So the cost of living is increasing for those of us who live here, and not, like European and Americans who just come down here because they hear this. So they are able to afford the rents that we're not able to afford, and we are left in situations that, okay, how can we afford rent every month? This is a question that I make myself every month, and this is a question that every Salvadoran is making themselves. My generation, I'm 32 year old. My generation doesn't dream of owning a house in El Salvador. So in terms of economic legacy, uh, I don't know. Maybe in 5 years, maybe he is everything he says he is. Maybe he's, the Messiah that was to come to save us all from our sins. I don't personally believe that, and they haven't been successful economically. But I think people should be cautious when they want Bukelismo. Okay, you want Bukelismo, you want to forfeit your rights, you want the police to be able to seek your house without a warrant, you want a gang caught with a deal caught with the gangs, you want to have no information whatsoever about what the government does with money. You want everything to be reserved, from the number of homicides to the number of deaths during the pandemic to the how many advisors does a congressman have, to how much they travel. Everything that I just said, and I could go on and on, is under lock in El Salvador. It's going to be under lock for 7 years because they control the institutions. Uh, so the Bukelismo is not just the fancy parts that you see in the paid YouTuber trips, or the influencers in TikTok. You have to see the larger picture. Everything that glitter isn't gold.
All right, Nelson, thank you very much. That was hugely informative. Thank you so much for coming on.
Okay, thank you for having me.
I'm here now with Juan Rojas, who's a columnist on Latin America at Compact magazine and written widely on the political affairs of countries well all across the region. So we're going to be discussing in a little bit more depth what's going on in El Salvador, what Bukele is, what Bukelismo might be, and what influence his rule in El Salvador might be having on the rest of the continent. Hi, Juan. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Alex.
Yeah, it's good.
Great on the podcast.
Yeah, well, it's been a while that this should have happened, and no doubt it'll happen in the future about other countries in the region. But let's get cracking on El Salvador. Not to repeat too much of what we've just heard in the previous interview, but my understanding and the gist that I got, also from the work that you've done on El Salvador, is that it's more the negotiations with gangs than the mass incarceration, which is what's worked in really bringing down the murder rate. Is that your kind of feeling on this as well?
That's a good question because it depends how you look at it. So, if we start from 2015, which was the peak homicide rate in the past 15 years, this current state of exception is responsible for at best like 5% of the reduction in murders. But if you look at, but the thing at the same time, the state of exception is still notable in the sense that it got murders below the homicide rate below a point that no one really thought possible. Really, in the past, negotiations with gangs had managed to get the homicide rate from around like 103 to I think like 17, or maybe
Per
around
100,000, yeah.
per 100,000 in 2022. But after the state of exception, it's been able to go allegedly now in 2024 to around like 2 per 100,000, which is around the same rate as Canada.
Yeah, I mean,
pretty
it's
remarkable.
crazy. Even if you think the numbers are cooked, and they may well be to some degree.
Yeah, they're adjusted a bit.
But even so, I mean, that's still a remarkable reduction, but a reduction that had already started. It was coming down from its peak before Bukele even took office. So I wonder what
Exactly.
it seemed to be. There was already negotiations going on between the former president, who was of the FMLN, of the kind of left wing party there. They were bringing down the murder rate because of through some arrangement with the gangs, and these things are obviously always kind of covert. You never really know the details of it. But Bukele has continued that decline, and it's hard to know exactly what to attribute it to. Obviously, all the his internal propaganda and also what his cheerleaders say will be pointing to, well, look, he's just been hard on crime and has just locked all these people up, just swept up huge swathes. I mean, the numbers are still, I mean, it bears repeating. 2% of the population.
Entire population, yeah.
It bears repeating. Like, I said it in the introduction to this podcast, but worth saying again. I mean, just kind of staggering numbers in a country of 6.5 million or something like that. So, but he is prone to, and as he would be, to emphasize that aspect. But it's not entirely clear, I think, exactly how to attribute this.
And the thing about that is that after the state of exception, there's a lot of credible evidence suggesting that he's still negotiating with the gangs. So El Faro's done reporting on this eyewitness testimony of non-gang members that were imprisoned during the state of exception have reported that they actually are treated worse than gang members, and gang members receive a lot of special privileges. So my take is that Bukele has found a way to combine both things, at the same time continue negotiating with gangs and also imprison vast numbers of gang members through the state of exception. But it is a bit tenuous, and this is why the big question that everyone should be focusing on is what happens when or if the state of exception ends. Because, and the gangs are more than just a criminal actor. They're a social phenomenon with familiar ties to their communities and stuff like that. So
Right.
there's also a lot of evidence that suggests that they haven't been completely disarticulated, as he likes to claim, and some of the government's own numbers are a bit suspicious.
Well, I think that, I mean, there's so many things to unpick there. I think it's worth dwelling a second on what exactly the gangs are. And I mean, gangs across Latin America, differ in terms of their role, their place within kind of larger infrastructures and networks of whether it's, drug trafficking or just local extortion. It seems that the gangs in El Salvador depend quite a lot on just extortion locally, of getting people to pay for protection. More than some of the more celebrated gangs, which are in Mexico or Brazil,
Yeah.
where they're known for trafficking.
Yeah, in that sense, technically, when you refer to a gang, it's just a criminal organization that operates on the street, and they tend to have more social bonds, whereas a cartel is a purely criminal organization. A lot of times, it's businessmen that decide to go into that profession, if you could call it that. For example, in Colombia, the famous Medellin cartel, a lot of those were like landed oligarchs, essentially, that just decided to go into the drug trade. But they are a bit different, and exactly their finances differ. I mean, there are gangs like the PCC in Brazil that are actively involved in drug trafficking, but actually the indication in Central America regarding MS-13 and Barrio 18 is a lot more tenuous, that they're that involved in drug trafficking, especially large-scale regional drug trafficking to the United States. They might be selling on the streets, and a lot of the gang members also consume drugs, but their chief means of financing is extortion, extorting the local vendor. Hey, you need to pay me 20% of your earnings every week, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I mean, selling drugs nationally in a country as small as El Salvador is not enough to give these gangs the kind of footprint that they
Exactly.
they would need. I mean, that there's just not enough revenue there for that. So one of the things that I mean, Bukele sells himself on, effectively providing peace, of holding up a kind of basic Hobbesian bargain with the citizenry, but are the gangs themselves being destroyed? Because the longer these things perpetuate themselves, the more they infiltrate the state, and erode the state's like effective sovereignty. So I don't know. I didn't really get a sense of how much they are actually being taken apart.
It's hard to know because there's also a lot of credible reporting from just ordinary Salvadorans that claim that the gangs are no longer extorting them. When you look at the numbers, there is an indication that extortion is still going on, but clearly much less than before. And that's key, because that does mean that the gangs are suffering a significant financial blow. On the other hand, there are other numbers that are less promising. For instance, before the state of exception, in the years before the state of exception, way more arms from the gangs were seized by authorities. Something like 500 in 2021 versus only like 100 in 2022 and 2023. Which Insight Crime has done some analysis on that. Their findings suggest that the gangs are actively concealing a lot of their arsenals and waiting for later. That's a strong indication that they haven't been destroyed or disarticulated. I mean, after all, the gangs are primarily a prison phenomenon, with the leadership mainly all being in jail. This is similar in Brazil and in Ecuador. A key difference there, actually, that's interesting with Ecuador, is that in a lot of the problem that precipitated the current crisis in Ecuador was a loss of control in the prisons, where really it was just the gangs that weren't in charge. And that's a factor that's key. Is who's really in charge here. It does seem like, I wouldn't deny that the government in El Salvador has more power. But there was a case where one of Bukele's ministers was observed entering one of the prison with masked guards that seemed to be gang members. That was reported on by El Faro. Another interesting case was Elmer Cárdenas, a gang member who was due to be, or who the U.S. had requested for extradition, and Salvadoran authorities abruptly released him, dropped all charges against him, just released him into the streets. So that's also quite suspicious. The U.S. is currently investigating Bukele. There's a case against him for negotiating with gangs. So
Yeah, I mean that does seem to be so present, and there's cases that we can think of, obviously from across the region where there's been also, over a shorter or mid range period of time where numbers drop in terms of, particularly homicides as the main indicator, and it then is revealed that there's some accord between politicians. Without getting onto the regional picture yet, we might worth dwelling a little bit on the kind of economics of El Salvador and what Bukele's rule looks like. I kind of provocatively asked in the previous interview whether he's a sort of Tony Blair figure, whether he's a kind of third way, but albeit set, in the 2020s and not in the 1990s. So the vibe's a bit different. It's a bit more populist, obviously, and of course, it's set in a much poorer country, where the state is weaker and so on. But nevertheless, there's some infrastructural investment, but there's also slashing or privatizing public services. He's increased pensions and the minimum wage, but at the same time, has arrested striking workers. So there's a kind of a third way kind of vibe there, especially if one considers the combination of, certain economically populist measures with some very kind of technocratic aspects. Obviously, probably the most obvious being the sort of Bitcoin utopia that he's trying to create and is failing to do so. It's important to say. So
yeah, it was a complete debacle.
yeah, so it seems like a kind of a neoliberal with economically populist measures to bolster support, which to me does sound kind of third way-ish.
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, he himself bills himself as a kind of third way, previously candidate, but now president, in the sense that his narrative is that he represents a break with the past, the two-party system of Arena and FMLN. And interestingly, this plays out in a kind of disturbing way that he's like stopped prosecutions against those that committed crimes during the Salvadoran Civil War. And if you saw this on Twitter, he tore down the statue that the FMLN put up celebrating the end of the Civil War. Which anyway, let's not go into that. But his view is that this, talking about these things are divisive. We need to move forward. Let's try to just forget this. And in ideological terms, you look at his party, Nuevas Ideas, and it's a big tent party. Most of the membership actually comes from the FMLN because he himself was part of the FMLN. He's a kind of ideological shapeshifter. At one point, he was quoted as saying he was part of the radical left. But he's also a businessman, so he'll naturally have some kind of libertarian proclivities. Also, El Salvador's financial situation is not great. They're heavily in debt and have a really tight situation. But so yeah, you do see this mix where he's willing to spend more, for instance, on public works. And there are these great libraries and trains that he's building, all this kind of all these investments that he's made that naturally require a lot of spending, but he seems to have made up for it on the other hand by cutting other services. Yeah, he like cut funding for like 13 of the country's 30 hospitals, and expediently, thanks to the state of exception, arrested workers that were demanding back pay. So it's all very convenient, but kind of to be expected if you know who he is.
So to move on to kind of the regional picture, because it's kind of widely talked about. I mean, I had a piece open here from Folha de São Paulo, the kind of newspaper of record in Brazil,
Yeah.
which has a list of other countries in the region who have tried to institute or promised to do so certain policies very similar to Bukele, or even citing him by name. And you can run through it. It's probably not worth dwelling on each example, but here there's examples from Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, Haiti, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and so on. And obviously, not all of these have heads of state who have tried to implement Bukele-like policies. But some have, and I think Ecuador is probably the most obvious one that's being talked about because of its crisis, because of its state of emergency that's been declared there. So
Yeah.
maybe you could tell us a little bit about what's happened in Ecuador and how the Bukele model fits in with that.
Ecuador is interesting because the way I see it, a state of exception is totally warranted. The country quite literally a month ago was engulfed into a crisis, a serious emergency. And the preliminary numbers are actually encouraging that the number of homicides have gone down, I think from like 30 to 9 per day, but this is very early on. But the problem with these states of exception, every country under the sun in Latin America has tried states of exception. But as I said before, as soon as you end the state of exception, what happens to everyone that was arrested? Typically, they all go free because the systems of justice in Latin America are so poor. You have to gather evidence, try each individual gang member. A lot of times there's mistrials, there's not enough judges, the prosecutors are not competent. It's really, really tough. And so that's essentially the reason why criminality is able to thrive. I mean, crime is actually an extremely complicated phenomenon. There's lots of debates whether, reducing poverty will actually reduce crime. There's situations where that's not the case, and other cases where it is. All of these factors go together. But in the case of Ecuador, I would argue that most likely, as soon as the state of exception ends, a lot of the security gains will. I mean, it might be better than before, but they'll probably evaporate. Noboa's predecessor instituted multiple states of exception, 60-day states of exception, and in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really do much. Similarly, Lasso is quoted as saying that he would never do what Bukele has done because it's not democratic and Ecuadorians would never stand for it. Similarly, I don't think that Noboa would go that direction either. Noboa seems like a sincere Democrat. He's kind of a center-right figure. He's a banana oligarch, essentially. But I wouldn't think that his background and his term of office so far doesn't really suggest to me that he would be willing to go the distance that Bukele has, or that he could, because there's a lot of other problems of being able to indefinitely renew a state of exception the way Bukele has, because countries like Ecuador still have checks and balances, whereas El Salvador does not. One last thing before I turn it to you. Also, the other important example is next door in Honduras that actually has prolonged a state of exception since November 2022. And it's been nowhere near as successful as the Salvadoran one. It's actually reduced homicides, evidently. But we have the data shows that most of those that have been arrested do not ultimately go to prison, unlike in El Salvador.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and just to dwell on the Ecuadorian case, because that used to be a country which was one of the safer ones in the region, and which seemed to have successful some advances under Rafael Correa in kind of from the end of the 2000s into the early 2010s, and who then more recently has been criticized by the right for having been soft on crime and trying to pin the blame on him, which seems to be completely not true, basically. It has to do, as with many of these cases, to do with criminal markets, right? And how those shift and change. We have to be kind of a bit economistic on this regard. And it is the fact that Ecuador became a central, exporting place for drugs coming from Colombia and from Peru and so on. And it's the presence and strength of those gangs which has changed the situation and also led to the massive increase in homicides there.
Yeah. I mean, it's That's an interesting one to parse because I've read some compelling accounts that suggest that some of what Correa did in the sense of his management of prisons, the state's loss of control of its over what was going on in its own prisons, started under his term. But on the other hand, homicides, yeah, actually went drastically down during his term, and that's credited a lot to social investment. That can be the case. But the contrasting case, and that's why I say that this kind of one to one of like, poverty being responsible for crime is a bit tenuous at times. Because the other case is Venezuela, whereas poverty went down, homicides actually drastically went up.
Yeah.
And that's also related in that the state lost control over its own prisons and most of the country. But it is curious. On the other hand, there's a lot of compelling evidence that suggests that the neoliberal policies of Correa's successor Moreno and then Lasso of cutting budgets, social services, and including on security as well, massively contributed to the crisis that we see today. But as you mentioned, a huge important factor are just natural um, dynamics changes that we see in the market for drugs. Related to that, criminal economies, homicides tend to go up and down relative to so many different factors. You can't always blame it on the policies of the president. But in the Ecuadorian case, it's clear that, for instance, the demobilization of the FARC reconfigured a lot of the criminal economies in Colombia, and also the pandemic. There's been this huge uh, drop in the price of coca in Colombia that no one is exactly sure why. The best theory seemingly is that there was a lot of overproduction during the pandemic, and they couldn't export much of the finished cocaine because all the borders were closed. And so now they're sitting on this huge stockpile that has since caused the price of the raw coca to go down. That may have contributed to a lot more competition for routes in Ecuador to Europe and in Asia, etc. And
Right.
the Mexican cartel is also rushed in. There's this kind of proxy war between some of the gangs that are allied with Sinaloa and then CG and J, CJ and G.
Well, I mean, it'd be good if if at least the financial press covered the comings and goings of the drug market and indeed criminal markets in general in their business
They should. A lot
pages.
of their
Just
readers
treat
are
it
probably involved. So
well. That's true, but I mean, just also in terms of portraying this as a this is a matter of business. These are corporate matters.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, exactly. Yeah, that's a great point.
And what the violence often increases when there's conflict. I mean, I know the case from Brazil, so I can't really speak too much for the rest of the region, but the highest murder rates are always associated with conflicts over territory between gangs.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
where you have an effective monopoly, I mentioned this already in the previous interview, where you have an effective monopoly by one gang, the PCC in the case of Sao Paulo,
Hmm.
things are relatively okay. They don't want a lot of blood on their hands, which complicates business for them. So these things
Yeah,
are
and that's all
not
due
often
to
straightforward.
negotiations between security forces and the PCC. This has been well documented, or at least there's a lot of compelling evidence in that favor. It's alleged, but
Yeah, yeah, no, indeed. So anyway, I mean, I think to bring it to the wider social context, because there is, I mean, actually, just before that, maybe you want to talk about Colombia, actually, and the extent to which, because you have this piece in America's Quarterly about the Colombian president Petro and Bukele and what they have. A problem they have in common, but they themselves have sparred over their kind of differing approaches.
so in Colombia, yeah, this was around in March 2022 or 2023. Both Petro and Bukele are these horrible Twitter warriors, and they had this back and forth where Petro accused Bukele of, being authoritarian and not respecting human rights for displaying, these displays of gang members in the prisons and whatever, half naked. And then, Petro also accused Bukele of, still negotiating with the gangs, but doing so covertly, unknown to the public. Whereas, he does so overtly and is trying to do so legally. That's another story. But so yeah, Bukele clapped back that he's way more popular, and that Petro's corrupt because his brother, chief of staff, and who else is it? Um, oh, I forget now, but there's a ton of people in his administration that are currently under investigation. Some of which for receiving money from drug traffickers during his 2022 presidential campaign. But the Colombian case is interesting because Petro's Paz Total initiative, it's in a way, yeah, the same thing that Bukele has been doing since he became mayor of San Salvador, and even before then, of Nuevo Cuscatlan. Bukele is documented, or at least alleged to have been negotiating with gangs for many, many years now. And that's part of the reason why he's supposedly so good at it. One of the things I argue is that a lot of these things, there's a learning curve to them, both repression and also negotiating with criminal groups. The results are only as good as the negotiator and the specific agreement that's struck. To that end, Petro has had a really interesting initiative since he came into office and campaigned on this, that he wanted to negotiate with all of Colombia's most important criminal groups, the ELN, the AGC, Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia. They're kind of this paramilitary successor group today. The country's most important drug trafficking organization, has many thousands of members. And so the idea is that in exchange for giving like reduced sentences and other benefits to members of these criminal groups, they will agree to disarm and also turn themselves in. Sounds good on paper. The problem is coming to specific agreements with so many of these groups at the same time is extremely difficult. It's also tenuous because a lot of times one group will take advantage of the other negotiating to try to fortify itself and encroach on other territories, etc. You have to verify that they're also complying by whatever agreement is struck. There was some early promising data out of Buenaventura that the city's two largest street gangs came to an agreement to limit homicides and begin negotiating with the government. This actually reduced homicides drastically, but evidently that hasn't lasted. Moreover, it took a long time for the government to be able to overhaul the pertinent laws to be able to begin directly negotiating with these groups. But as I argue in that America's Quarterly piece, long term, there are still problems. If you really want to reduce violent crime, you need to be able to hold those accountable. So you need to be able to fortify your courts, laws, pertinent criminal justices, hire good prosecutors and judges, such that a majority of crimes are eventually convicted, which is not the case throughout most of Latin America.
And it remains the case that they're joining drug gangs or other sorts of gangs, criminal enterprises, is still a better opportunity than the other opportunities on offer for a lot of working class and poor kids across the region. So that doesn't seem to be. We'll touch on this in just a second. But we've talked a lot about, I guess, the supply of these policies, but the demand for these policies also, in large part, comes from below. And we're going to continue this discussion over on Patreon at patreon.com/bungacast. So please subscribe if you want to listen and see, if you're watching us, the rest of this discussion. If not, catch you later. Bye-bye.